Alright, our topic for today, pre-Renaissance intellectual life. This is another one of those looks at the before picture, because we won't really get what was new and distinctive about the Renaissance without a look at what intellectual life was like in the Middle Ages. So, first of all, I guess, it's a popular misconception that in the Middle Ages there was no learning, or at least no thought. That the church dictated what was correct and nobody was allowed to say or think any different. Now, when you really look at that, though, it turns out to be misguided and pretty oversimplified. Even if the church had been interested in a total monopoly on everything that was being said and thought, there was no way they could have done a thing like that. The Pope could never have personally supervised and enforced what was being taught and published all over Christendom. I mean, God was all-powerful and all-knowing. The Pope was not, especially in this era before modern communications technology. I mean, it took months to even really find out what was being said on the other side of Europe. And the popes weren't interested in micromanaging intellectual discourse anyway. They'd intervene once in a while. Now and then a rogue theologian would come up with some seriously wrong idea that could really pose a danger to a significant number of souls. And when that sort of thing happened, they'd step in and stop the guy. You know, that's clearly counter to the church's interests. But they had a good system. By and large, the vast majority of the time, intellectual activity continued on its own terms. It was conducted by a professional class of scholars whose goals were all basically the same. You know, advance understanding of whatever it was that they were studying, while remaining true to the spirit of Scripture and the truths necessary for salvation. It goes without saying that this professional class of scholars, they were clergymen, all of them. Intellectual life was sort of self-regulating by means of vigorous argument. Now, the church did have a de facto monopoly over intellectual life. And the reason for that lies in the early Middle Ages. It's not that the church really had a concrete argument in favor of why it should be the one to control the discourse on all these things, but kind of by default, the church ended up in charge of learning and literacy in the early Middle Ages when nobody else could do it. We no longer talk about a Dark Ages per se, but it is true that there was an era in the wake of the fall of the Roman Empire when things got bad. There was breakdown, sort of reached pretty far down the scale. I mean, no central government, no law and order, no more indoor plumbing. In this kind of environment where everybody's attention was taken up with barbarian raids and where their next meal was coming from, you know, nobody had time for intellectual pursuits. Literacy fell off a cliff. There were no schools, almost no books. The only people who had any time to pay attention to that stuff was the church. They had to, because Christianity is a religion based on a book. Without literacy, I mean, how are we going to understand the truths of our faith? How are we going to train new priests? How are priests going to say Mass? So the clergy were the group of people for whom literacy was a professional imperative. So as time went on, the original crisis passed, but the status quo continued. Education wasn't being withheld from everybody else, they just didn't need it. I mean, regular people, farmers, shoemakers, knights, had absolutely no need for literacy. They did need to use the tools of the written word once in a while. If you need a will or a legal contract drawn up, talk to a priest. They're the ones who can do stuff like that. Lords kept clergy members on staff to take care of their bookkeeping. That's why the words cleric and clerk have a common origin. So I think that answers question 1. That was the setup, how these things were organized. What was the result? So, since the clergy were the ones conducting intellectual activity, they pursued topics of study according to their interests and their practical needs. Now, it's worth This is hard to think about, but it's worth pausing to consider. Our medieval forebears were not very interested in learning for its own sake. Some of them did pursue extracurricular study and thought as kind of a hobby, but the clergy was a professional class, and for them, knowledge was one of their tools in carrying out their main responsibilities, prayer and pastoral work. The general aim of learning was to help them understand the Bible better. The study of nature, for example, was interesting mainly in the aspect of being able to more effectively admire God's creation. Salvation was the main thing. There was less interest in the properties of this world, which the Bible instructs us pretty specifically to pay no attention to the things of this world because they're soon to pass away, and we really ought to be concentrating on our souls, right? But they did have a job to do, and there were some intellectual tools they needed to do it. So here we've got the curriculum that was in use throughout the Middle Ages, really. It had been developed in the early Middle Ages based on a Roman educational model, and studied mostly through textbooks written in the late Roman period. So the course of study here, we've got this is the 7 liberal arts. Maybe some of you are familiar with this. They're divided into 2 categories, as we can see from this handy color coding. The trivium and the quadrivium. So on the one hand, we've got the language arts, I guess you'd say, of grammar and logic and rhetoric. The quadrivium was more scientific and mathematical pursuits, astronomy and math. They were especially interested in geometry and physics, having to do with astronomy. Also, arithmetic. So, these were the traditional subjects of study, but we can see that there were particular reasons why the clergy were interested in each one of these things. It wasn't just because everybody ought to have a good grounding in math, So, first and foremost, they needed the tools of literacy and eloquence, public speaking, for a daily use in their activities. But even these subjects in the quadrivium had important practical applications for church business. Yeah, obviously arithmetic, keeping track of financial accounts. Astronomy and math has to do with the clock and the calendar. And that's because they were responsible for praying at the correct time. Monks in monasteries had the liturgy of the hours where about 8 times a day they had to stop what they were doing and go off to church and pray. And especially, much of the interest in astronomy had to do with the calendar. And a big sort of practical imperative there was calculating the date of Easter. Now, Easter is one of those movable feasts that operates on a confusing set of rules. It's like the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the vernal equinox, I think, but it's not my job to keep track of these things. But the point is, it's not like the Pope can just send out a newsletter to all the parishes, saying when Easter is this year. This was a thing that people in local churches were responsible for calculating themselves. Maybe in each diocese, the bishop would have a math guy, who would be the one to tell him when Easter should be this year, and then maybe he would communicate that to the rest of his parishes. But this is a thing that local churches are kind of on their own for, and wouldn't it be awful if some of us got off track and were celebrating Easter on the wrong date? So this was a priority for them. And in terms of geometry, it was practically only the church that was conducting sort of big important building projects during this era. I mean, medieval churches, they're astonishing. Anybody who has been to Europe and seen these things, it's just amazing. First of all, they stand as monuments of art in the in the course of human history. And number 2, to think about the tools they had and the understanding of engineering that they were working with to be able to build these amazing things. Especially when you consider all of the tools and prior knowledge we have that they didn't have. These folks were not dumb. They really figured that stuff out. So each element of the liberal arts curriculum here was in some way important for the needs of the clergy, and that's why they kept all that stuff around. They had a job to do, right? Beyond that, there were the three great professional disciplines studied in the equivalent of grad school: medicine, law, and theology. So theology, you might not be surprised to discover, was the most important and most prestigious of these. And medicine and law obviously have very useful applications, but in terms of pure science, theology was like the physics of today, and the more abstract, the more prestigious it was. So advances in theology were what was seen as the most important intellectual priority of the Middle Ages. Now, one thing worth noting is the invention of the university. This new kind of school, different from the monastery and cathedral schools that preceded it, was invented around 1200 and quickly took off, spreading all over Europe by the 15th century. You'll see the red dots here. The oldest universities always kind of remained the most prestigious to a large extent. We can see Cambridge in England. The University of Paris was really kind of the first one. In some places, it took a while for them to really catch on to the idea. Germany doesn't seem to have had any universities before the 14th century, but they eventually caught on too. By 1500, we've got universities all over Europe. A whole lot of the university institutions and terminology we know today actually have roots in the Middle Ages, starting with the academic robes and regalia worn now only at graduation. Now, thinking about methods, you might ask, in the Middle Ages, how could they have had intellectual activity like we'd recognize it, since they didn't have the scientific method? Well, they had a different method. One that was very well suited to what they were doing. One that focused on logical argument and debate. It involved starting with a proposition. Say, we know God exists. Then what you do, first you line up all the possible arguments on one side. You line up all the possible arguments on the other side. No, there is no God. Then, on each side, this is a very methodical process. You examine each one of these arguments, sifting out the ones that are weak or can be disproved, identifying the strongest ones. Finally, you line up the strongest arguments on either side, sort of make them fight, see who wins. So the scholastic method is typified by the public debates on theological questions that were often held at these universities. But we also see it operating just the same way in writing. To take the shining example of scholastic theology, the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas. As sort of a postscript, what you might notice about the scholastic method is that it's perfect for settling questions based on logical argument, but it doesn't seem to have a strong focus on evidence. Now, this was a method that was used in multiple disciplines, but it was developed for the study of theology. The tools they were using were source texts like the Bible, authoritative texts like the Church Fathers, the foundational theologians of the past, and their own logical reasoning. Theology doesn't really have data or evidence per se. Now, in the course of the 14th through 16th centuries, more scholars gradually became interested in the study of the physical world, what we would call science, and they would find the scholastic method was not adequate for what they needed. When we reach about the time of Galileo, we'll see this develop into a serious argument. In the Renaissance, they didn't really attack the scholastic method, because they were interested in studying things like Latin and literature, the secular humanities. They were mostly attacking scholastic priorities in terms of study. But when we reach the following period, which we call the Scientific Revolution, we will see a direct attack on the scholastic method. And we'll see Galileo with his telescope in the forefront of that. But that's still to come. For right now, we'll concentrate on the intellectual activity of the Renaissance, and now hopefully we'll have a better basis for understanding how it was different from what came before.